What happens when a species that has never known true desperation meets one forged in the fires of endless conflict? The Galactic Council thought they understood humans through their sanitized diplomatic reports and carefully curated cultural exchanges. They saw a young species eager to please, quick to smile, and always willing to share stories around the communal fires of space stations. But stories, they believed, were just entertainment. Fabrications. Impossible tales of individuals standing against armies, of last stands that somehow became victories, of humans doing the unthinkable when everything seemed lost. The aliens laughed at these stories. They found them charming in their impossibility, endearing in their naive optimism. After all, what civilized species would glorify such brutal, reckless behavior? What rational beings would celebrate throwing logic aside for emotional impulses? They were about to find out that some stories aren't just entertainment. Some stories are warnings. Some stories are promises. And some stories are about to become reality. The recreation deck of the GSV Harmony buzzed with the usual evening chatter of a dozen different species. Crystal and Zarathi clicked their approval at shared jokes, while the slug-like Malari slithered between conversation groups, their translator units humming with multilingual banter. The air recyclers worked overtime to accommodate the various atmospheric preferences, creating small pockets of different gas mixtures throughout the massive communal space. Commander Sarah Chun sat quietly in the corner, nursing her synth coffee and watching the social dynamics play out. She had been the human liaison aboard the Galactic Council's flagship for 8 months now, long enough to understand the unspoken hierarchies and cultural nuances that governed interspecies relations. Long enough to know that humans were still considered the newcomers, the primitive upstarts who had somehow stumbled into faster-than-light travel despite their obvious limitations. The Vorthack delegation dominated the center of the room, their imposing 12-foot frames and thick, armor-like hide, making even the largest of the other species seem small by comparison. They were warriors by nature, their entire civilization built around concepts of honor and strength. Yet for all their martial appearance, they had known peace for over 3 centuries. Their wars were now fought in simulation chambers and sporting arenas. Human Chun called out Warlord Thax, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to resonate through the deck plating. "Join us. We were just discussing your species' fascinating tendency toward creative storytelling." Sarah set down her cup and made her way over, recognizing the tone. This wasn't the first time her people's stories had become a source of entertainment for the other species. She nodded politely to the gathered aliens and took a seat on one of the adjustable chairs. "What stories in particular?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. A Zarathi named Kristrix chimed in, her voice like whined through crystal formations. "The one about the human soldiers who held a bridge against impossible odds. What was it called? Thermopylae? The mathematical improbability alone makes it quite amusing. Or the story of the human who single-handedly destroyed an entire enemy installation," added Malari Representative Glindox, his words creating small bubbles in the translation medium that surrounded his slug-like form. "What was his name? John Rambo." Such delightful fiction. Sarah felt the familiar tension building in her shoulders. Those aren't fiction. They're historical accounts. The gathered aliens exchanged glances that, despite their vastly different physiologies, all somehow managed to convey polite disbelief. Warlord Thax leaned forward, his massive head tilting in what Sarah had learned was a gesture of condescending amusement among his people. "My dear human, we mean no offense. Your species has a wonderful imagination, and we find these tales quite entertaining. But Surely you cannot expect us to believe that individual beings, acting alone or in small groups, could accomplish such statistically impossible feats. The numbers simply don't work, Christrix added, her form shifting through different prismatic configurations as she calculated. 300 warriors against several hundred thousand? One individual against an entire military complex? These scenarios violate every principle of tactical mathematics and strategic doctrine. Your stories always follow the same pattern, observes Euphonian Ambassador Keel, his gas form swirling within its containment suit. Desperate situation, impossible odds, and somehow victory through, what do you call it? Grit? Determination? These are emotional concepts, not tactical advantages. Sarah took a slow breath, feeling the weight of 8 months of similar conversations. Maybe that's because you've never been in a situation where those things mattered more than numbers or logic. The comment drew chuckles from around the group. Warlord Thax gestured broadly with one of his massive arms. We Vorthack understand warfare better than any species in the galaxy. We have studied every form of combat, analyzed every tactical scenario. What your stories describe is not warfare, it is fantasy. The Vorthack are correct, agreed Zarathi Science Director Prism. We have run extensive simulations of your historical accounts. The failure rate approaches absolute certainty in every scenario. No rational being would attempt such actions when the mathematical outcome is predetermined. That's exactly the point, Sarah said quietly. No rational being would. The comment sent another wave of amusement through the group. This time, even some of the other species who had been quietly listening joined in the laughter. Sarah recognized several members of the Hedonic Collective, a species that had eliminated conflict from their society through technological enhancement of their pleasure centers. Next to them stood a delegation from the Pragmatic Republic, a civilization that had reduced all decision-making to pure mathematical optimization. "Oh, this is rich," wheezed Malari Glindox, his translator struggling to convey the sound of his species' laughter. "So your position is that humans are fundamentally irrational? That you succeed precisely because you make decisions that are mathematically unsound?" "Sometimes," Sarah admitted, "when the math says you can't win, but winning is the only option that matters, you stop caring about the math." Warlord Thax leaned back in his reinforced chair, which groaned under his massive weight. "This explains much about your species' trajectory. 12 major wars in your recorded history, countless smaller conflicts, entire civilizations rising and falling through violence. Most species achieve spaceflight long before they require external intervention to prevent self-destruction. The Galactic Council had to establish the Sol system as a protected zone to prevent human self-annihilation," added Zephonian Ambassador Keel. "Your tendency toward irrational decision-making nearly eliminated your species before you could join galactic society." Sarah felt her jaw tighten. The protected zone was still a source of tension between humanity and the Council. Officially, it was for humanity's own protection, preventing them from accessing certain technologies until they proved they could use them responsibly. Unofficially, everyone knew it was because the other species found human unpredictability unsettling. "Tell us another story," suggested Christrix. Her form shifting to what Sarah had learned indicated eager anticipation. "Perhaps something even more impossible than your previous examples." "I have one," said a new voice from the edge of the group. Sarah turned to see Dr. Elena Vasquez, another human aboard the ship, approaching with a data pad in her hand. Elena worked in the xenoanthropology department, studying the cultural development patterns of various species. "Dr. Vasquez," Warlord Thax rumbled approvingly. "Please share another of your species' delightful impossibilities with us. Elena glanced at Sarah, and something passed between them. Sarah recognized the look. Elena had been having these conversations too, and she was just as tired of them as Sarah was. This one's about a place called Sarajevo, Elena began, settling into an empty chair. During one of our wars, a city was completely surrounded by enemy forces. Cut off from supplies, under constant bombardment, no hope of rescue. The siege lasted nearly 4 years. The tactical situation sounds hopeless, observed Prism, her crystalline form already beginning the calculations. How long before the city surrendered? It didn't, Elena said simply. The silence that followed was broken by what could only be described as polite confusion from a dozen different species. I'm sorry, Malari Glindox finally said, his translator working overtime to convey his bewilderment. Did you say the city never surrendered? That's correct. For nearly 4 years, 2 million people lived under siege conditions. They were shot at by snipers while trying to get water. They ate grass and rats to survive. They burned furniture and books to stay warm. Children grew up never knowing what it was like to walk outside without fear of being killed. And they never surrendered. Warlord Thax shifted uncomfortably in his chair. But surely, once the tactical situation became untenable, they must have recognized the logical course of action. The logical course of action was surrender, Elena agreed. It would have saved lives, ended the suffering, restored normal conditions. But the people in that city decided that some things were worth suffering for, worth dying for, if necessary. But what could possibly be worth such a rational sacrifice? Asked Ambassador Keel, his gas form agitated within its containment suit. Their home, Sarah said quietly. Their identity, their right to exist as themselves rather than as whatever their conquerors wanted them to be. The gathered aliens fell silent, processing this information. Sarah could see them struggling with the concept. Every species represented in the room had achieved interstellar capability through rational development, logical progress, and peaceful resolution of conflicts. The idea of choosing suffering over submission, of selecting probable death over certain survival, was as alien to them as their physiology was to her. This is another fictional account, surely, Christrix finally said, though her usual confident chiming had taken on a hesitant quality. No civilized species would behave in such a manner. I can provide you with historical documentation, Elena offered, holding up her data pad. Video recordings, eyewitness accounts, casualty reports. It's all quite real. But why? Prism demanded, her calculations apparently failing to produce comprehensible results. What was gained by this stubborn refusal to accept defeat? What tactical advantage was achieved through prolonged suffering? Sarah stood up slowly, feeling the weight of every similar conversation she'd had over the past 8 months. You want to know what was gained? The city survived. The people maintained their identity. They proved that some things can't be taken by force, only given up willingly. And they never gave up. At what cost? Warlord Thax asked, his tone carrying genuine confusion. How many died needlessly? How many resources were wasted? What could have been accomplished if those same people had applied their efforts to productive pursuits? The cost was terrible, Sarah admitted, but the alternative was worse. Sometimes the choice isn't between good and bad outcomes. It's between dying as yourself or living as something else entirely. The silence that followed was longer this time, broken only by the ambient sounds of the ship's systems. Sarah could feel the weight of a dozen different forms of alien attention, all trying to process information that simply didn't fit their worldview. Your stories all share this common theme. Mallory Glindox finally observed his tone thoughtful. Individuals or small groups making mathematically unsound decisions when faced with overwhelming opposition. And somehow, according to your accounts, these irrational choices lead to positive outcomes. Not always, Elena interjected. Sometimes the desperate stand fails. Sometimes the lone hero doesn't save the day. Sometimes the city falls despite the sacrifice. But the attempt matters. The choice to try, even when logic says it's hopeless, that's what makes us human. Christrix's form shifted through several rapid configurations, her species' equivalent of nervous energy. But surely you can see how these accounts appear to other species? The mathematical impossibilities, the violation of tactical doctrine, the emphasis on emotional decision-making over logical analysis. I can see how they might seem impossible to species that have never faced that kind of desperation, Sarah replied. But understanding something requires more than mathematical analysis. Sometimes you have to experience it. Warlord Thax made a sound that Sarah's translator interpreted as dismissive laughter. Experience is overrated, human shun. Proper analysis and logical thinking prevent the need for such desperate circumstances in the first place. The Vorthak have not faced a serious military threat in 3 centuries because we plan properly. The Zarathi have eliminated conflict through mathematical optimization of resource distribution, added Prism proudly. Logic prevents the conditions that lead to your species' dramatic scenarios. And yet, Elena said, standing to join Sarah, when the Council faces a situation that requires what you might call creative solutions, they always seem to call on humans. Why do you think that is? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah could see the various aliens processing it uncomfortably. It was true. In the 8 months she'd been aboard, she'd been consulted on several problems that had stumped the other species' more logical approaches. Humans think differently, Ambassador Keel finally admitted. Your irrationality sometimes produces unexpected solutions. It's useful in small doses. Useful, Sarah repeated, tasting the word. Like a tool that you keep in storage in case the regular tools don't work. That's not what I meant, Keel protested, though his gas forms swirled in patterns that suggested uncertainty. Actually, I think it is exactly what you meant, Elena said. Humans are the emergency option, the backup plan when logic and mathematics fail. We're the ones you call when you need someone to do something impossible. Warlord Thax straightened to his full imposing height, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. The Galactic Council values human contributions to our collective endeavors. Your species brings a unique perspective to problem solving. A unique perspective, Sarah mused. Is that what we're calling it? The conversation was interrupted by a priority alert that echoed throughout the recreation deck. Captain Zalther's voice, speaking in the careful multi-species common tongue, filled the space. All department heads and senior staff to the command center immediately. We have received a distress signal from the Kepler Research Station. This is not a drill. Sarah and Elena exchanged glances as the various aliens began dispersing, their earlier amusement replaced by professional concern. As the human liaisons, they were expected to attend all senior staff meetings, though their input was rarely requested. Another impossible situation? Elena asked quietly as they made their way toward the command center. Probably, Sarah replied. And I'm willing to bet that before it's over, someone's going to suggest doing something that the math says can't work. As they walked through the corridors of the massive vessel, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that their evening's entertainment was about to become something much more serious. The other species might find human stories amusing, but She had a suspicion they were about to discover the difference between stories and reality. The command center buzzed with activity as they arrived, various species manning their specialized stations while Captain Zalther coordinated the response. The main view screen displayed a tactical overview of the Kepler system, with several red indicators showing the source of the distress signals. Report: Captain Zalther commanded as the last of the senior staff arrived. Science Officer Quinth, one of the insectoid hive collective representatives, stepped forward with a data pad clutched in his multiple arms. The Kepler research station has been attacked by unknown hostile forces. The station's defenses were overwhelmed in less than 30 minutes. Current status of the research personnel is unknown. What kind of research was being conducted at Kepler? Asked Chief Medical Officer Vex, her amphibian features showing concern for potential casualties. Experimental quantum communication technologies, Quinth replied. The work was classified, but the implications for galactic communication networks were significant. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's temperature controls. Quantum communication research meant the ability to send instantaneous messages across any distance, the kind of technology that could revolutionize galactic civilization or give whoever controlled it an insurmountable military advantage. What do we know about the attacking forces? Captain Zalther inquired. Very little, admitted Quinth. The attack was swift and coordinated, suggesting advanced tactical capabilities. The hostiles appear to have been specifically targeting the research data rather than the station itself. A raid, then, observed Warlord Thax, his tactical mind already analyzing the situation. Professional and efficient. This suggests a well-organized force with specific objectives. Sarah raised her hand tentatively. Captain, what's our response timeline? How long do we have before we reach the system? At maximum velocity, 18 hours, the captain replied. Though I'm not certain what response would be appropriate given the limited information we have about the hostile forces. Surely a diplomatic approach would be preferable, suggested Ambassador Keel. If we can establish communication with the attacking forces, we might be able to negotiate for the safe release of any survivors. The mathematical probability of successful negotiation depends heavily on the motivations of the hostile forces, Christrix chimed in, her form already calculating scenarios. If they sought only the research data, they may have no reason to harm the personnel. Sarah found herself studying the tactical display, her mind automatically analyzing sight lines, defensive positions, and potential approach vectors. It was a habit she'd developed during her time in Earth's military, before she'd been selected for the diplomatic corps. What if they're not done? She asked quietly. The question drew attention from around the command center. Captain Zalther turned to her with what she'd learned was a politely curious expression among his species. Elaborate, Commander Chun. If they wanted just the research data, a quick raid would make sense. But what if the research wasn't the end goal? What if it was just the first step in something larger? An interesting hypothesis, Prism acknowledged. But without additional data, such speculation is not particularly useful for response planning. Sarah nodded, but continued to study the tactical display. Something about the attack pattern bothered her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. Captain, Warlord Thax rumbled, I recommend we proceed with standard protocols. Approach the system carefully, attempt to gather intelligence on the hostile forces, and then determine the appropriate response based on the tactical situation. A logical approach, agreed Science Officer Quinth. We should also consider requesting additional support from the nearest Council patrol vessels. The closest support is 47 hours away, Captain Zalther noted. If there are survivors at the research station, they may not have that long. The command center fell silent as everyone processed this information. Sarah could see the various officers calculating probabilities, analyzing risk factors, weighing potential outcomes against tactical doctrine. "There is another consideration," she said finally. "If the hostiles have the quantum communication research, they won't need much time to implement it. Once they establish that capability, tracking them becomes exponentially more difficult." Commander Chen raises a valid point, admitted Chief Medical Officer Vex. However, proceeding without proper intelligence or support could result in the loss of this vessel and all aboard. Sarah looked around the command center at the gathered alien officers, all of whom were applying logical analysis to a situation that might not respond to logic. She thought about the stories that had entertained them just an hour earlier and wondered if any of them were beginning to see the connection between those impossible tales and their current impossible situation. "Captain," she said, her voice carrying a certainty that surprised even her, "I think we need to stop thinking about this as a standard tactical scenario." The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones. This time, it carried the weight of recognition, the dawning realization that they were facing exactly the kind of situation where human irrationality might be more valuable than alien logic. The tactical briefing room aboard the GSV Harmony had never felt more crowded, despite its considerable size. Representatives from every major species clustered around the central holographic display, which showed the Kepler system in devastating detail. Red markers indicated the destroyed sections of the research station, while pulsing orange dots marked the locations of the unknown hostile vessels. Captain Zalther manipulated the display controls with his four-fingered hands, zooming in on the station's remains. Long-range sensors confirm that the station's central core is intact, though heavily damaged. If there are survivors, they would most likely be in the emergency shelters located here. He highlighted several areas deep within the station structure. "The hostile vessels are maintaining a defensive perimeter around the station," reported Warlord Thax, his massive frame leaning over the tactical analysis station. 6 ships, unknown configuration, but their energy signatures suggest advanced shielding and weaponry. Sarah studied the display from her position near the back of the room. Elena stood beside her. Both of them officially present as observers rather than tactical advisors. In the 2 hours since they'd received the distress signal, the alien officers had conducted a thorough analysis of the situation using every logical framework available to them. The results were not encouraging. Mathematical models indicate that a direct assault has a success probability of less than 12%, Christrix announced, her crystalline forms cycling through calculations at a visible rate. The hostile vessel's positioning creates overlapping fields of fire that would devastate any approaching force. Diplomatic contact attempts have yielded no response, added Ambassador Keel, his gas form swirling with frustration inside its containment suit. Either they are unwilling to communicate, or they lack the technical capability to receive our transmissions. Science Officer Quinth clicked his mandibles together in what Sarah had learned was a sign of deep concern among the species. The quantum communication research represented 15 years of collaborative work between 7 different species. If that technology falls into hostile hands, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the room understood the implications. Instantaneous communication across galactic distances would give whoever controlled an insurmountable advantage in any conflict. They could coordinate attacks across multiple star systems simultaneously, making defense impossible. "What about the approach vectors?" asked Chief Medical Officer Vex, gesturing at the holographic display with one of her webbed appendages. "Surely there must be some way to reach the station without direct confrontation with the hostile vessels." Warlord Thax manipulated the display to show the system's asteroid field and planetary debris. The hostiles have positioned themselves to control all viable approach routes. Any vessel attempting to reach the station would be detected long before reaching weapons range. Sarah found herself studying the tactical situation with growing unease. The alien officers were approaching the problem with typical logical methodology, analyzing each variable and calculating probabilities for various courses of action. But something about the hostile positioning bothered her, a nagging sense that they were missing something important. "The pattern doesn't make sense," she said quietly, more to herself than to the room. Captain Zalther's head turned toward her, his large eyes focusing with the intensity that indicated genuine interest. "Explain your observation, Commander Chun." Sarah realized that everyone in the room was now looking at her, and she felt the familiar weight of being the resident expert on impossible situations. If they wanted the research data, they got it in the first 30 minutes of the attack. If they wanted to eliminate witnesses, they would have destroyed the entire station rather than leaving survivors in the emergency shelters. Perhaps they lacked the firepower to completely destroy the station, suggested Science Officer Quinth. "No," Warlord Thax rumbled, his tactical mind following Sarah's line of reasoning. "The damage patterns indicate they could have eliminated the station entirely if they chose to. Commander Chun is correct. Their actions suggest a different objective." Elena stepped forward, her xenoanthropology training evidently reaching similar conclusions. "They're not behaving like raiders or even military forces pursuing strategic objectives. Their positioning and action suggest they're waiting for something." "Waiting for what?" asked Christrix, her calculations now incorporating this new variable. Sarah studied the display more carefully, focusing on the hostile ship's positions relative to the station and the system's hyperspace jump points. A cold certainty began to form in her mind. "They're waiting for us," she said. The silence that followed was absolute. Every alien officer in a room turned their attention to the holographic display, suddenly seeing the tactical situation from an entirely different perspective. "A trap," whispered Chief Medical Officer Vex, her amphibian features showing the first signs of panic that Sarah had seen from any council species. "But that would require advanced knowledge of our patrol routes, response protocols, and tactical capabilities," protested Ambassador Keel. "The mathematics of such coordination across interstellar distances becomes trivial if you have quantum communication technology," Sarah finished. "Which they now do." The implications hit the room like a physical force. These weren't random raiders who had stumbled onto valuable research. They were part of a coordinated operation that had specifically targeted the quantum communication project, knowing that a council vessel would respond predictably to the distress signal. "We must withdraw immediately," Christrix declared, her form shifting through rapid configurations as she recalculated their tactical position. "If this is indeed a trap, our arrival will only provide them with additional advantages." "What about the survivors?" Elena asked, her voice carrying an edge that Sarah recognized as barely controlled anger. "The logical course of action is to withdraw and request significant reinforcement from the Council fleet," Warlord Thax stated firmly. "We cannot help the survivors if we are destroyed ourselves." Sarah looked around the room at the various alien faces, all of them nodding in agreement with this assessment. From their perspective, it was perfectly logical. The tactical situation was untenable, the risks were too great, and preserving their vessel and its crew was the priority. "So we abandoned them," she said quietly. Captain Zalther made a gesture that she'd learned indicated regretful necessity. "Commander Chun, I understand your emotional response to this situation. But we cannot allow sentiment to override tactical reality. This isn't sentiment, Sarah replied, her voice gaining strength. This is exactly the kind of situation where your logical approach guarantees failure. I failed to see how abandoning logic would improve our tactical position. Prism interjected, her crystalline structure shifting to indicate skepticism. Sarah moved closer to the holographic display, studying the hostile positioning one more time. Because they're counting on us to be logical. This entire trap depends on us following standard council protocols, approaching carefully, analyzing the situation thoroughly, and then withdrawing when the mathematics indicate unacceptable risk. Which is precisely what we should do, Warlord Thax rumbled. Commander Chun, your species' tendency toward irrational decision-making may be entertaining in social settings, but this is a genuine military situation. Exactly, Sarah said, turning to face the assembled officers. And when has the Council ever faced a genuine military situation? When was the last time any of your species had to make life-or-death decisions under impossible circumstances? The question hung in the air unanswered, because everyone in the room knew the answer. The Galactic Council had been at peace for centuries. Their military vessels were primarily used for exploration and patrol duties. None of the represented species had faced real combat in living memory. Your point? Asked Science Officer Quinth, his mandibles clicking with what Sarah now recognized as growing agitation. My point is that peaceful species think peacefully, Sarah explained. You analyze, calculate, and optimize because you've had the luxury of time and safety to develop those approaches. But the hostiles waiting for us don't think that way. How do you know how they think? Challenged Ambassador Keel. Sarah gestured at the tactical display. Because this trap is perfect for catching logical opponents, but it has a fatal flaw if you're willing to do something that doesn't make mathematical sense. Elena stepped up beside Sarah, apparently reaching similar conclusions. The hostiles have positioned themselves to control all rational approach vectors, but they've left themselves vulnerable to irrational ones. Elaborate, Captain Zalther commanded, his tone indicating genuine interest despite his obvious skepticism. Sarah manipulated the display controls, highlighting a particular trajectory through the system's debris field. Direct approach through the asteroid field. No cover, no tactical advantage, mathematical probability of success near zero. Which is precisely why it's a poor tactical choice, Warlord Thax pointed out. Unless the enemy isn't expecting anyone to be stupid enough to try it, Sarah countered. Their positioning assumes we'll attempt to use available cover and approach vectors that provide tactical advantages. But what if we don't? Christrix's form went through rapid calculations before settling into a configuration that Sarah had learned indicated deep confusion. The mathematics are clear, Commander Chun. A direct approach would result in the destruction of this vessel with 94% probability. What about the other 6%? Elena asked. The question seemed to short-circuit the alien officers' thinking processes. They stared at the display, trying to process the concept of deliberately choosing an approach with a 6% success rate. 6% is not a viable tactical option, Science Officer Quinth stated firmly. No rational commander would risk an entire vessel and crew based on such odds. You're right, Sarah agreed. No rational commander would. The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones. This time, Sarah could see the alien officers beginning to understand what she was suggesting, and the implications terrified them. Commander Chun, Captain Zalther said carefully, "Are you seriously proposing that we deliberately choose the tactical option with the lowest probability of success?" "I'm proposing that we choose the tactical option that the enemy isn't prepared for," Sarah replied. The one that doesn't appear in their mathematical models because no logical species would ever consider it. This is madness, Christrix declared, her form cycling through agitated patterns. You're suggesting we commit suicide based on emotional impulses rather than tactical analysis. I'm suggesting we do something unpredictable, Sarah corrected. Something that doesn't fit the pattern they're expecting us to follow. Warlord Thax stood to his full imposing height, clearly struggling with concepts that violated everything he understood about military strategy. Even if such an approach somehow succeeded in reaching the station, what then? We would still be outnumbered 6-1 against hostile vessels with superior positioning. Then, we do something else that doesn't make mathematical sense, Elena suggested. We adapt, improvise, and hope that our unpredictability gives us enough advantage to save the survivors. Hope is not a tactical doctrine, protested Science Officer Quinth. It is for humans, Sarah said simply. The statement seemed to crystallize the fundamental difference between human and alien thinking. Sarah could see the various officers struggling to process the concept of hope as a viable military strategy, their logical minds rejecting the idea even as they try to understand it. Captain, Warlord Thax said formally, I must protest any course of action based on such irresponsible reasoning. The loss of this vessel would be catastrophic for Council operations in this sector. Agreed, added Christrix. The mathematical certainty of failure makes this proposal unacceptable from any rational perspective. Captain Zalther looked around the room at his senior staff, all of whom were nodding in agreement with a logical assessment. Then his gaze settled on Sarah and Elena, the only two beings present who seemed to think that a 6% chance was worth taking. Commander Chun, he said slowly, explain to me how your species survived long enough to develop spaceflight if you consistently make such mathematically unsound decisions. Sarah thought about the question carefully, remembering the stories that had entertained the aliens just hours earlier. Because sometimes the mathematically sound decision is surrender, and surrender means extinction. When those are your only options, you learn to make impossible things possible. Or you die trying, added Elena matter-of-factly. Yes, Sarah agreed. Sometimes you die trying. But sometimes dying while trying is better than living with not trying at all. The alien officers exchanged glances that conveyed bewilderment, fascination, and more than a little fear. They were beginning to understand that humans didn't just tell impossible stories. They lived impossible realities. What exactly are you proposing? Captain Zalther asked finally. Sarah turned back to the tactical display, her mind already working through approaches that violated every principle of space combat doctrine. We go in fast and loud through the worst possible vector. No stealth, no tactical subtlety, no logical approach patterns. We make ourselves the biggest, most obvious target possible. That would guarantee immediate enemy response. Warlord Thax protested. All 6 hostile vessels would focus their fire on us simultaneously. Exactly, Sarah said with a smile that seemed to unnerve the assembled aliens. Which means they won't be focusing their fire on the station. The realization dawned slowly across the room. Sarah could see the various officers beginning to understand not just her tactical proposal, but the fundamental difference in thinking that made such proposals possible. A distraction, whispered Chief Medical Officer Vex. You're proposing to use our vessel as a distraction. I'm proposing we give the survivors a chance to escape while the hostiles are busy with us, Sarah clarified. It's not a perfect plan, but it's better than abandoning them. The mathematical probability of our survival approaches 0, Christrix stated flatly. The mathematical probability of the survivors' rescue without our intervention is 0, Elena countered. At least this way, someone might make it out. Captain Zalther studied the tactical display for a long moment, his alien features unreadable. And if we fail? If our vessel is destroyed and the survivors are still trapped? Sarah met his gaze steadily. Then, we failed trying to do the right thing instead of succeeding at doing nothing. The answer seemed to resonate with something deep in the captain's psychology, despite his species' logical nature. He continued to study the display, and Sarah could see him wrestling with concepts that challenged everything he'd been trained to believe about command decisions. There is one additional factor to consider, Warlord Thax said reluctantly. If the hostiles do possess functional quantum communication technology, allowing them to escape with it could have consequences far beyond this single incident. The technology could be used to coordinate attacks across multiple systems simultaneously, Science Officer Quint added. The strategic implications for galactic security are severe. Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of the decision they were contemplating. All the more reason to try something they won't expect. Captain Zalther made a sound that Sarah's translator couldn't quite parse, somewhere between a sigh and a growl. Commander Chun, if we proceed with your proposal, what role do you envision for yourself in this mathematically impossible endeavor? Whatever role you need, Sarah replied. But I'd recommend putting me in charge of tactical coordination. The suggestion sent a visible shock through the assembled alien officers. Christrix's form cycled through rapid configurations while Science Officer Quinta's mandibles clicked in what sounded like alarm. Commander Chun, Captain Zalther said carefully, while I respect your unique perspective on this situation, tactical coordination requires extensive training and experience with space combat protocols. You're right, Sarah agreed. But it also requires the ability to make decisions that don't make mathematical sense. And right now, that might be more important than following protocols. The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably long. Sarah could see the various officers processing the implications of putting a human in charge of what amounted to a desperate last stand against impossible odds. Captain, Elena said quietly, there's something else to consider. If we're going to do something this crazy, we need someone making decisions who's comfortable with crazy. The math doesn't work, the tactics don't work, and the protocols don't work. Maybe it's time to try something that might work precisely because it shouldn't. Captain Zalther looked around the room one more time, taking in the faces of his logical, rational, mathematically minded senior staff. Then, he looked at Sarah, who was proposing to deliberately choose the worst possible tactical option because it was the only one that offered any hope at all. Commander Chun, he said formally, I am placing you in charge of tactical coordination for this operation. May whatever gods your species believes in have mercy on us all. As the senior staff dispersed to begin preparations for what everyone knew was likely a suicide mission, Sarah found herself alone with Elena at the tactical display. The holographic representation of the Kepler system glowed between them, showing the trap that waited ahead and the impossible odds they were about to face. Think it will work? Elena asked quietly. Sarah studied the display one more time, her mind already working through the countless variables that could determine success or failure. Honestly, probably not. The math really is terrible. But someone has to try, and maybe, just maybe, being willing to try is enough. Elena nodded, understanding the weight of what they were about to attempt. Like the stories. Yeah, Sarah agreed, thinking about all the impossible tales that had entertained the aliens just hours before. Like the stories. As they prepared to leave the briefing room, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to discover whether human stories were just entertaining fiction or something much more dangerous. promises of what ordinary people could accomplish when faced with extraordinary circumstances. The command center of the GSV Harmony had been transformed into something that bore little resemblance to the orderly, logical space it had been just 4 hours earlier. Emergency lighting cast harsh shadows across alien faces as they worked frantically to prepare for what every mathematical model predicted would be their final mission. Commander Sarah Chun stood at the center of it all, her human form dwarfed by the massive alien officers surrounding her, yet somehow commanding the room through pure force of will and the terrible logic of desperation. The tactical display showed their approach vector through the Kepler system's asteroid field, a path so direct and exposed that it violated every principle of space combat doctrine. "Weapons systems report ready," announced Lieutenant Crix, one of the Vorthack tactical officers, his voice carrying the barely controlled fear that had infected the entire crew. Though I must note that our armament was never designed for sustained combat against multiple hostiles. "Shields at maximum capacity," added Chief Engineer Threx from her station, her crystalline appendages moving rapidly across her controls. "However, our defensive systems are optimized for asteroid impacts and spatial anomalies, not military-grade weaponry." Sarah nodded, accepting each report with the same calm determination she'd maintained throughout their preparations. "Dr. Vasquez, what's the status of our communication array?" Elena looked up from her station, where she'd been working with Science Officer Quinth to modify their systems. "We've rigged a broad-spectrum emergency broadcast system. If they are survivors in the station's emergency shelters, they should be able to receive our signal. And the message?" "Simple and direct," Elena replied. "When the shooting starts, they need to get to the escape pods and launch immediately. We've programmed the pod's navigation systems with rally coordinates in the outer system." Captain Zalther approached the tactical station, his usual composed demeanor showing cracks of stress that Sarah had never seen before. "Commander Chun, the crew is as prepared as possible for this endeavor. I must ask one final time, are you certain this is our best course of action?" Sarah looked around the command center at the alien faces watching her, all of them intelligent beings who understood mathematics, probability, and the logical certainty of their approaching doom. She thought about the stories that had amused them just yesterday, tales of impossible stands and desperate victories that these rational species had dismissed as entertaining fiction. "No, Captain," she said honestly, "I'm not certain of anything except that doing nothing guarantees failure. This gives us a chance, even if it's a small one." "A 6% chance," Christrix reminded her from the science station, her form cycling through agitated patterns. "The mathematics have not improved." "Mathematics aren't everything," Sarah replied, then paused as she realized what she'd just said. In a room full of species that had built their entire civilizations on logic and mathematical optimization, she was essentially rejecting the fundamental principles that govern their existence. "For your species, perhaps," Warlord Thax rumbled from his position at the weapons console. "But the rest of us have achieved our current level of development precisely because we do not ignore mathematical realities." Sarah turned to face the massive Vorthack warrior, seeing in his expression the same mixture of fascination and fear that she'd noticed in all the alien officers. And that's exactly why this might work. They're not expecting anyone to ignore mathematical realities. The proximity alarms chose that moment to sound, indicating their imminent arrival at the edge of the Kepler system. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as the abstract planning suddenly became immediate reality. "Drop us out of hyperspace at the designated coordinates," she ordered. "All stations report status." The main view screen flickered to life, showing the Kepler system in all its tactical complexity. The damaged research station hung in space like a wounded animal, surrounded by the 6 hostile vessels that maintained their perfect defensive formation. Long-range sensors confirm hostile positions unchanged, reported Science Officer Quinth. They are maintaining their perimeter exactly as predicted. No response to our arrival. Added Communications Officer Vril, her gas form swirling with nervous energy. Either they have not detected us, or they are maintaining communication silence. Sarah studied the tactical display, noting how the hostile ships had positioned themselves to cover every logical approach vector to the research station. It was textbook defensive deployment, mathematically perfect for intercepting any force that attempted to reach the station through conventional means. "They've seen us," she said with certainty that surprised the alien officers. "They're just not reacting because we're not where we're supposed to be." "Explain," Captain Zalther requested. Sarah highlighted their current position on the tactical display. Standard Council doctrine would have us approach from the system's edge, using available cover and conducting reconnaissance before engaging. Instead, we dropped out of hyperspace directly in line with their defensive formation, which places us in the optimal position for them to destroy us, Warlord Thax pointed out. "Exactly. It's so obviously suicidal that they're probably still trying to figure out what we're really doing." As if to confirm her words, the communication array suddenly crackled to life. A voice speaking in accented common filled the command center, its tone carrying unmistakable confusion. "Council vessel, you are in violation of standard approach protocols. Alter your course to comply with sector regulations." Sarah couldn't help but smile at the bewilderment in the hostile commander's voice. "They're trying to get us to act logically." "Should we respond?" asked Communications Officer Vril. "Not yet," Sarah replied. "Let them think we're confused or having technical difficulties. The longer they spend trying to figure out what we're doing instead of shooting at us, the better." She turned to address the entire command crew. "Remember, our objective isn't to win a space battle. Our objective is to create enough chaos to give the survivors a chance to escape. Everything we do from this point forward is about buying time and drawing attention." "Time until what?" asked Chief Medical Officer Vex, her amphibian features showing the strain of their impossible situation. "Until we do something so crazy that it works, or until we die trying," Sarah replied with a bluntness that sent a visible shiver through the assembled aliens. The tactical display updated as their sensor arrays gathered more detailed information about the hostile vessels. Sarah studied the data, looking for any weakness she could exploit in what appeared to be an impregnable defensive formation. "Their ships are using interlocking fields of fire," she observed, "mathematically perfect for preventing any approach to the station, which is why our current course is suicidal," Christrix reminded her yet again. "No," Sarah said slowly, an idea beginning to form in her mind. "It's why our current course is perfect." She manipulated the tactical display to show projected trajectories and weapons ranges. "They've positioned themselves to stop ships trying to reach the station. But what if we're not trying to reach the station?" The alien officers stared at the display, trying to follow her reasoning. Elena was the first to understand. "You want to ram them," she said quietly. "Not ram," Sarah corrected. "Threaten to ram. There's a difference." Captain Zalther's eyes widened as he grasped the implications. "You intend to use our vessel as a projectile weapon." "I intend to make them think I'm using our vessel as a projectile weapon," Sarah clarified. "The threat of a kamikaze attack should be enough to disrupt their formation, especially since none of their tactical models account for commanders who are willing to destroy their own ships." "Because it's completely irrational," Warlord Thax protested. No military commander would sacrifice their vessel and crew for such marginal tactical advantage. Which is exactly why it will work, Elena added, catching on to Sarah's strategy. They'll have to respond to the threat, which means breaking their perfect defensive formation. Sarah nodded and turned to the helm officer. Full speed ahead. Direct course for the largest hostile vessel. Make it look like we've lost our minds. That should not be difficult, muttered Christrix under her breath. The next few minutes passed in tense silence as the GSV Harmony accelerated toward the hostile formation at a speed that guaranteed mutual destruction if they maintained their course. Sarah watched the tactical display, noting how the defensive formation began to show signs of strain as the hostile commanders tried to process what they were seeing. "They're breaking formation," reported Science Officer Quinth, his mandibles clicking with nervous excitement. "Two vessels are moving to intercept our trajectory." "Perfect," Sarah said. "That opens a gap in their defensive perimeter. Signal the research station. Emergency evacuation. All personnel to escape pods immediately." Communications Officer Vril worked frantically at her station, broadcasting on all emergency frequencies. If anyone is alive in those emergency shelters, they should receive the signal. The main view screen showed the hostile vessels beginning to maneuver in response to their apparent suicide run. Sarah could imagine the confusion and alarm among the enemy commanders as they tried to decide how to respond to tactics that violated every principle of rational warfare. "Enemy vessels are powering weapons," Warlord Thax announced. "They appear to be preparing to fire." "Let them," Sarah replied calmly. "The longer they wait, the more committed they become to their response pattern." "Commander Chun," Captain Zalther said urgently, "at our current speed and trajectory, we will reach the point of no return in approximately 90 seconds. Sarah studied the tactical display one more time, watching as the hostile formation continued to adapt to their impossible approach. Two ships had broken off to intercept them. A third was repositioning to provide support fire, and the remaining three were struggling to maintain coverage of the research station with a decimated formation. "There," she said suddenly, highlighting a gap in the defensive perimeter that had opened as the hostile ships repositioned. Escape pod trajectories show survivors launching from the station. On the tactical display, small contacts were separating from the research station, the tiny escape pods accelerating toward the outer system on courses that would take them away from the hostile vessels. The enemy formation was too disrupted to intercept all of them. "Emergency maneuver," Sarah ordered. "Full reverse thrust. Maximum evasive action." The bridge crew stared at her in shock as she essentially ordered them to abort their suicide run at the last possible moment. The GSV Harmony shuddered as its engines fought to change course, the deck plating groaning under the tremendous stress of the maneuver. "You're not actually going to ram them?" asked Elena, though her voice carried relief rather than surprise. "Of course not," Sarah replied as she watched the hostile vessels struggling to adapt to their sudden course change. The threat was enough to disrupt their formation and give the survivors a chance to escape. The tactical display showed the escape pods continuing their flight toward the outer system, now beyond the range of the hostile vessel's weapons. Meanwhile, the enemy formation was in complete disarray as their commanders tried to process Sarah's apparent change from suicidal to merely insane. "This is impossible," Christrix declared, her form cycling through rapid calculations. "You cannot have planned this sequence of events with such precision." "I didn't plan it," Sarah admitted. "I just knew that if we did something crazy enough, they'd have to respond, and any response would give us opportunities we wouldn't have had otherwise." "But how did you know they would respond in this specific manner?" pressed Science Officer Quinth. Sarah thought about the question, try to explain the intuitive understanding that came from growing up in a species that had faced impossible odds regularly. Because when someone threatens to do something completely irrational, rational people try to find rational responses. And rational responses to irrational actions are often predictably inadequate. The communication array crackled to life again, this time with the voice of the research station's senior scientist. Council vessel. This is Dr. Morrison from Kepler Station. 17 survivors evacuating in emergency pods. We have the quantum research data with us. A cheer went up from the alien officers, the first sign of genuine optimism Sarah had seen from them since the crisis began. But her attention was focused on the tactical display, where the hostile vessels were beginning to regroup into a new formation. They're adapting, she observed. Now that they know we're not actually suicidal, they'll adjust their tactics accordingly. Can we reach the escape pods before the hostiles intercept them? Asked Captain Zalther. Sarah studied the trajectories, running calculations that didn't require mathematical optimization, just practical understanding of relative positions and velocities. Not if we try to do it logically. The alien officers exchanged glances that had become familiar over the past few hours. The mixture of resignation and anticipation that came with waiting for Sarah to suggest something that violated their understanding of tactical reality. What do you propose? Elena asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer would be something impossible. Sarah manipulated the tactical display to show a new course projection, one that would take them directly through the center of the reforming hostile formation. We go through them instead of around them. That's even more suicidal than the ramming attempt, protested Warlord Thax. No, it's just more direct, Sarah corrected. They're expecting us to try clever maneuvers and tactical subterfuge. They've repositioned to counter logical escape attempts. But they haven't positioned themselves to stop someone who simply ignores their defensive formation. Chief Engineer Threx looked up from her console, her crystalline features showing strain. Our shields cannot withstand concentrated fire from 6 hostile vessels. The mathematical certainty of destruction approaches absolute. Then, we don't give them time to concentrate their fire, Sarah replied. Full speed, minimum time in their weapons range, and hope that our unpredictability is worth more than their superior positioning. Captain Zalther studied the tactical projection for a long moment, his alien features unreadable. Commander Chun, this plan depends entirely on factors that cannot be calculated or controlled. Yes, Sarah agreed. That's what makes a human. The statement seemed to crystallize something in the minds of the alien officers. They looked at her with a new understanding, no longer seeing her as a reckless primitive, but as a representative of something genuinely different. A species that had evolved in circumstances where impossible odds were simply another type of weather to be endured. All stations, prepare for combat maneuver, Captain Zalther announced. We are going to attempt something that has never been tried before, because someone who has never accepted impossible odds is going to tell us how to do it. The next few minutes unfolded like a fever dream of space combat, doctrine turned inside out. The GSV Harmony accelerated directly toward the hostile formation, not attempting evasive maneuvers or tactical subtlety, simply committing to reaching the escape pods regardless of the mathematical impossibility of survival. The hostile vessels opened fire exactly as predicted, but their coordination was disrupted by the sheer audacity of the Council ship's approach. Weapons designed to stop cleverly maneuvering targets proved less effective against a vessel that was simply ignoring them and continuing on course. Shields at 60%. Chief Engineer Threx reported as energy beams lanced across their hull. Structural integrity holding, but we cannot sustain this level of damage for long. Sarah watched the tactical display as they passed through the heart of the hostile formation, close enough to see the individual weapon emplacements on the enemy ships. "Almost through," she announced. "Prepare to intercept the escape pods." The GSV Harmony emerged from the hostile formation battered, but intact, having accomplished something that every mathematical model said was impossible. Behind them, the enemy vessels were struggling to turn and pursue, their formation completely disrupted by having to fire on a target that had passed directly through their midst. "Escape pods in range," reported Science Officer Quinth, his voice filled with amazement. "Beginning recovery operations." One by one, the small escape pods were pulled into the Harmony's landing bay, each one carrying survivors who had been written off as casualties just hours earlier. The quantum research data that had started the entire crisis was safely aboard, along with the scientists who had developed it. "All escape pods recovered," announced Chief Medical Officer Vex. 17 survivors confirmed, including the senior research team. Sarah looked around the command center at the alien officers who had followed her through the most irrational series of tactical decisions in Galactic Council history. They stared back at her with expressions that she was only beginning to understand. Not admiration or fear, but something closer to recognition. "Ow," asked Christrix, her form cycling through calculations that refused to produce comprehensible results. How did any of this work? Sarah thought about the question, remembering the stories that had started this entire adventure, the tales of impossible stands and desperate victories that had entertained these same officers just a day earlier. "Because sometimes the impossible thing isn't impossible," she said finally. "It's just improbable. And improbable things happen all the time if you're willing to try them." Warlord Thax approached her, his massive frame no longer intimidating, but somehow respectful. "Commander Chun, I owe you an apology. I believe your species' stories were fantasy, entertaining, but ultimately fictional accounts of mathematically impossible events." "They are mathematically impossible," Sarah agreed. "But mathematics isn't the only way to measure possibility." Elena joined them at the tactical station, looking exhausted but satisfied. "What now?" "The hostile vessels are still out there, and they still have quantum communication technology." Sarah studied the tactical display one more time, noting that the enemy ships were beginning to regroup yet again. But something had changed in their formation, a subtle difference that spoke of uncertainty rather than tactical confidence. Now, they have to decide whether they want to face opponents who do impossible things on a regular basis, she said. "And I'm betting that's a mathematical problem they're not equipped to solve." As if to confirm her words, the long-range sensors detected the hostile vessels beginning to withdraw from the system, apparently deciding that the quantum communication technology wasn't worth facing an enemy that refused to follow logical tactical doctrine. "They're retreating," announced Science Officer Quinth, his mandibles clicking with what Sarah had learned was the insectoid equivalent of laughter. 6 ships with superior firepower and tactical positioning are withdrawing from a single council vessel that should have been destroyed hours ago. Captain Zalther approached Sarah with an expression that she couldn't quite read. "Commander Chan, I find myself in the unusual position of needing to explain to the Galactic Council how we accomplished a mission that our own analysis indicated was impossible." Sarah smiled, thinking about how she would explain to her own species that she had just turned alien prejudices about human irrationality into a tactical advantage. "Tell them it was just another story, Captain. Another impossible tale about humans doing things that don't make mathematical sense." "But this time we saw it happen," Christrix observed, her form settling into configurations that indicated deep thoughtfulness. "This time, we participated in making the impossible real." As the GSV Harmony set course for home, carrying its rescued survivors and their invaluable research data. Sarah found herself looking around the command center at the alien officers who had followed her into the impossible and emerged victorious. They had learned something that day, something that couldn't be taught through mathematical analysis or logical deduction. They had learned that sometimes the difference between victory and defeat wasn't about having better numbers or superior technology. It was about being willing to try things that shouldn't work, simply because they might. Elena approached her as the crew began securing from battle stations, her expression thoughtful. Think they'll ever look at our stories the same way again? Sarah glanced around at the alien faces, noting the new respect and understanding in their expressions. I don't think they'll ever look at us the same way again. Is that good or bad? Sarah thought about the question, remembering the laughter and condescension that had greeted their stories just a day earlier. Now, those same beings had seen what happened when humans stopped being entertainment and started being themselves. I think it's honest, she said finally. For the first time since we joined the Galactic Council, they're seeing us as we really are. As the stars wheeled past the viewports and the GSV Harmony carried its crew home from their impossible mission, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what other situations might arise where human irrationality would prove more valuable than alien logic. The galaxy was a vast place, full of challenges that couldn't be solved through mathematical optimization or logical analysis. And humanity, with their talent for making impossible things possible, had just proven that they were exactly what the galaxy needed. Even if the galaxy didn't always appreciate being saved by beings who refused to accept that some things couldn't be done. The age of human stories being dismissed as entertaining fiction was over. The age of human stories becoming galactic reality had just begun.